The wind howled across the empty stretch of Colorado highway like a wounded animal, flinging stinging sheets of snow in every direction as if the sky itself had shattered. In the blinding white chaos, a dark figure pushed against the storm, broad-shouldered, steady, and frighteningly calm for a man walking through a blizzard with visibility barely an arm's length. Malik Harrow had survived sandstorms, firefights, and missions no one would ever know about, but it was the sharp, thin cry from somewhere beyond the swirling white that froze him in place. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was a child. And in that instant, instinct took over, the same instinct that had saved lives long before he traded his Navy SEAL uniform for a quieter life he was still learning to live. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of stepping up when someone needs you most, make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel Soul of Light. It truly helps stories like this reach more hearts. Malik forced his way through the storm, boots sinking deep into powder that swallowed his footprints as soon as he lifted his foot again. He had been on his way to deliver emergency supplies to the ranger station, but everything changed the moment he heard that cry. As he pushed forward, shapes slowly emerged from the storm. First a frozen road sign bent sideways, then what looked like a van half, buried in snow. The windshield was shattered, the doors iced over, and the entire vehicle tilted in a way that told him it had spun out hard before the storm smothered it. He approached cautiously, his military mind scanning for danger, even though logic told him what he was about to find wasn't a threat. When he reached the side of the van, he saw a woman slumped against the window, her body shielding two small children huddled beneath her arms. He yanked the door open with a force powered partly by training and partly by fear, the fear of finding them too late. The woman looked up, her eyes dull with exhaustion and tears frozen in streaks across her cheeks. Her name, he'd learn later, was Rowan Astor, a widow who had been driving her daughters, Haven and Maris, to visit their grandparents when the incoming storm forced road closures and panic sent drivers into survival mode. They had been stranded for hours before Malik found them, the cold slowly stealing strength from their small bodies. Rowan whispered something he couldn't fully hear, but the message was clear in the desperate look she gave him. She was at her limit, but she had kept her girls alive, and that alone told Malik everything he needed to know about the fierce heart of the woman half, conscious before him. Malik gathered the children first, lifting them against his chest to transfer warmth before wrapping Rowan's arms around his neck. The storm whipped at them, but he moved with steady purpose, fighting the wind as if it were an opponent he knew how to outmaneuver. The cabin he lived in, isolated, sturdy, and built with the kind of practicality only a man trained for survival would possess, stood about half a mile away. On any normal day, he could jog that distance without breaking a sweat. In the blizzard, burdened with 3 precious lives depending on him, it felt like trekking across an endless, hostile expanse. Every step grew heavier, the weight not from the people he carried, but from the responsibility. Memories Malik had tried to bury rose with frightening clarity. Teammates he couldn't save, promises he made but couldn't keep. But today, he vowed, would not be another addition to that list. When he finally reached the cabin, he kicked the door open and ushered them inside, warmth blasting against their frozen skin. He set the children near the fire and wrapped them in blankets before carefully lowering Rowan onto the couch. The room slowly filled with the sound of crackling logs and the faint, shaky breaths of the family he had just rescued. Malik worked quickly, warming water, checking their fingers and toes for frostbite, and forcing himself to stay focused. Rowan watched him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, as if she couldn't quite understand why a stranger had come for them in their darkest moment. Malik didn't ask the questions that flickered in her eyes. Instead, he simply continued doing what needed to be done. As hours passed, color returned to little Haven's cheeks, and Maris finally unclenched her tiny fists from the blanket. Rowan's strength slowly resurfaced, though exhaustion sat heavily in her gaze. It wasn't until the storm outside softened into a quieter snowfall that she managed to speak, her voice rough but warm. She told Malik how her husband, Grayson, had died the previous year from a sudden illness that swept him away before they could even prepare themselves. She spoke about the move across states, the unfamiliar roads, and how she thought she could beat the storm before it fully settled. Grief lived in her voice, not sharp and loud, but quiet and constant like a low, burning ember. Malik listened, leaning against the stone hearth, hands clasped loosely in his lap. Listening had never been his strongest skill. He had spent years giving orders or following them, but something about Rowan's voice pulled stillness out of him. Something about the way she spoke about her late husband reminded him of the fragility of life, of how fiercely people could love even when the world felt determined to break them. He didn't share his own story, not yet. He didn't tell her about the teammate he lost overseas, the brother in arms who took a bullet meant for him. He didn't tell her how he had returned home to a world that moved too fast and felt too loud, and how he had come to this mountain cabin to find silence because it was the only place that didn't hurt. Instead, he said the one thing he knew mattered most in that moment, that her daughters were safe, that she had done everything right, and that she was stronger than she believed. Over the next few days, the blizzard cleared, revealing a white, glazed landscape sparkling beneath the pale winter sun. Malik helped fix Rowan's vehicle, using the practical skills his past life had forged into him. He taught Haven how to stack firewood properly and showed Maris how to carve small shapes into soft pine with gentle, careful strokes. Rowan watched him, often quietly, sometimes with a faint smile curling at the edges of her lips. Something about Malik's presence grounded her. He moved through the world with intention, not urgency. He treated her children with gentle firmness and treated her with respect that carried no expectation. Every morning, Rowan found herself looking for him instinctively, whether he was outside splitting wood or tending the fire before anyone else woke. And every morning, Malik found himself checking the sound of the girl's laughter before letting himself exhale. A strange but natural rhythm developed, like they had all been living parallel lives that finally intersected at the right moment. But storms, internal or external, didn't disappear simply because the weather cleared. One afternoon, as the family prepared to head toward the nearest town for a checkup and supplies, Rowan's van refused to start despite everything Malik had done to repair it. The frustration hit her harder than expected, and she sank onto the snowy step, tears pushing forward before she could stop them. She wasn't crying about the van. She was crying because she was tired of being strong, of pretending she wasn't terrified every time something went wrong, of raising 2 children alone in a world that felt cold and unpredictable. Malik sat beside her, letting the silence speak first. He didn't tell her to stop crying or remind her that things could be worse. Instead, he placed a steady hand near hers, not touching, but close enough that she knew she wasn't alone. He had learned through quiet observation that Rowan didn't need rescuing from her pain. She needed someone willing to stand beside her through it. When her breathing finally steadied, he rose, walked to his truck, and returned with blankets for the girls. Then, in the simplest, calmest voice, he told her, "Come with me." Those 3 words weren't a command, not an order, not a promise of anything more than safety and help. They were an invitation to accept support, to trust that someone could stand with her without taking her independence or her dignity. Rowan nodded, gathered her daughters, and climbed into Malik's truck. The road ahead wasn't easy. There were miles to drive, forms to fill, repairs to arrange. But for the first time since her husband passed, she didn't feel like she was facing it alone. As the sun dipped behind the snowy ridge later that evening, Rowan looked at Malik across the small cabin they had returned to for one more night. Haven and Maris slept peacefully near the fire, their faces soft with the kind of rest children only manage under the watchful care of someone they feel safe with. And in that warm, golden glow, Rowan realized something she hadn't expected. Sometimes the universe sends help in the form of a stranger carrying his own scars. Sometimes healing begins in the quiet moments carved out by survival and shared humanity. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your engagement helps the Soul of Light community grow and reach more people who need these stories. Special request: comment "Hope lives here" if you felt the warmth of this story. And as Malik stood at the window, watching gentle snowflakes drift under the pale daylight after the storm, he didn't feel alone anymore either. The blizzard had taken many things from the mountain that week, but it had also delivered something unexpected. A reminder that broken paths can cross at exactly the right time, and that sometimes healing begins with 3 simple words spoken in the cold.